1916, 2016. Recently we had Jim Cullen from the US who gave a very interesting talk and packed house. And again tonight I see we have a full house, and so this should be a particularly good talk because Michael Byrne, as we know, is an expert on everything to do with Offaly and certainly on Tullamore. Just before we do that, I just want to draw your attention to other events which will be taking place. On March the 25th, the third in the series of talks on 1916 will be given by Philip McConway. And Philip, as most of you know, has done a great deal of work on this topic also. There will be a musical evening on the 22nd of March, and that will be here.
22nd of April.
Sorry, 22nd of April, here in this premises. There are other events organised by the County Council, and I'll draw your attention to the Irish Volunteers National Exhibition. That will take place in Kilroy's shop. You all know that, the building up on High Street. It takes place Friday the 18th and Saturday the 19th of March. Open daily from 11 to 5 and free admission. On display will be medals, uniforms, documents and many more items from the period. Members of the Irish Volunteers Organisation will be on hand to answer any questions you have. So that should be a very interesting exhibition. And actually, before I walked out tonight, I just happened to hear a little bit about the big exhibition in the museum, the Irish Museum, Collins Barracks, and it seems to be a fantastic museum. So this is our Offaly's bit here, the exhibition in Kilroy's and the national one in Collins Barracks. The other event is the big Offaly event. I'm sure you have seen this poster I've seen it everywhere around the town. That's the Together We Remember, again organised by the County Council, and the big event in Offaly. Together We Remember 1916-2016. Ceremony of Commemoration and Candlelight Walk. Assemble 5:40, the date, next Sunday, the 20th of March. Assemble 5:45 for 6 p.m. at the courthouse. Then the centenary concert in the church here in Tullamore, featuring, I see, a host of local entertainers, and some of them very well known, including Mundy, Donald Lunny, Simon Casey, Sean Ryan, Olivia Burke, Karen Martin, Dermot Guinan, Joe Maher, Rúlia Búlia, and musicians and choirs from across the county. So a county-wide event. That'll take place at 7:30. Now I'll give you reminders of those again at the end. So quite a bit there. So straight away I'll hand you over to Michael, and looking forward to that.
So look, good evening everybody. I want to talk this evening about the Tullamore incident of March 1916. If you Google incident, well, you get an awful lot of them. But if you Google Tullamore and affray, you'll only get two references. One in 1806 to the incident with the King's German Legion, and the other in 1916 with the Irish Volunteers. And in both cases, Germans were involved too, inverted commas, and women. And in 1806 there was a little difficulty between Irish soldiers in the British Army and German or soldiers from Hanover in the British Army, and the crux of the matter was the admiration for a few girls in the main street, and who was competing for them and who would win out. Now in 1916 this was a little bit more finessed in that there were certainly some of the people whose family were at the front were calling the Sinn Féiners pro-German, and of course there were ladies involved and there were women involved. And nowadays we call everybody a woman, but at that time we used to reserve ladies for more polished and more professional, more middle class people than we do today. So now that's I leave you to think about all that, and we'll move along to the talk. This picture here I found very interesting because We could dim the lights there, Deirdre. Would you like to do that? At the yeah, that's it. Excellent. That picture is quite significant, although it predates the incident by 6 years or so. But it shows our locus, if you like, is, if I have the right button here, is just here, about the 6th opening up. And over here we have the policeman who was injured in 1916, Sergeant Ahern. And he had been 34 years in Tullamore in 1916. Now these photographs tell lies. These postcards are a little bit like the modern day habit of photoshopping, in that maybe that cart wasn't there in the original scene. But certainly these people were there, and some of them were identified in 1961 in a reproduction of that picture at the time. So that's where I got my definitive view on Ahern being in the photograph. I thought it interesting because it showed a rather quiet street at the time, and everybody seemed to be getting on reasonably well. But coming on then to Easter 16, I suppose our question for tonight is what role had the Tullamore incident in the 1916 rising, if it had any? And in that regard, I would suggest that it did have a place and was firmly established with the publication of the Irish Times Sinn Féin handbook in late 1916, and again a more amplified edition in 1917. And you will see there on that page 1 of that publication that's the reprint of it there. You can see a report, which you won't be able to read from your distance, of the affray itself, where it says that it mentions St. Patrick's Day and the manoeuvres in Dublin City, and goes on then to say that on 20 March there was a difficulty in Tullamore in that there had been a dispute smouldering in the town for some time against the Sinn Féin volunteers, and it was manifested at a hurling match in aid of the Wolf Tone Memorial on the 19th, that Sunday. In any case, it was related to the sale of flags by Sinn Féin ladies or women for fundraising to buy guns, essentially. And there was a little bit of a dispute with some people whose family were serving in the British Army at the football field, and again on the following morning at the railway station in Tullamore. Now it has to be remembered that at that time there were up to 500 people from Tullamore serving in the British Army. Now that British is maybe the wrong word to use, because of course we were part of the Empire at that stage, and we were part of the United Kingdom, and it was only in 1921 of course that we succeeded in getting Dominion status. So what gives this event then more traction is the fact that, apart from the Irish Times publication, is the fact that two of the people involved in the affray, Peadar Bracken and Seamus O'Brennan, or Seamus Brennan, both escaped arrest on that evening and made their way eventually to Dublin. Brennan in particular headed off the following morning and was able to report matters to Pádraig Pearse, who took him up on the stage at St. Enda's and said to him that eulogising the action, stated that the first blood had been spilled for Ireland and the first blow struck in defence of the volunteers' right to carry arms. Now that quote is, one wonders, it was written down 30 years later. So I don't know how many of you could remember a statement that was made by somebody 30 years ago, but I suppose it was important too, in the sense that Pearse was somebody who was greatly admired by those who came in contact with him. And as you probably know, he was the son of an English sculptor, and he initially had a pro home rule point of view, and eventually he moved over after 1912 to a more Republican or more separatist viewpoint. Now he developed a great interest in the Irish language, and that's something I'll be coming to again in a moment, because from the 1890s there was a strong separatist strain. That sounds like some of these times they play the phone before the talk. Anyway, we've sorted it. So he became the editor of On Paper and Clive Solace, and he set up the school eventually. And by 1913 he was co-opted to the Supreme Council of the IRB. And the IRB was the Irish Republican Brotherhood, and was an organisation that was contained within the Irish Volunteers and was represented in a number of other bodies. And its ambition was to have officer people contained in various bodies such as the Gaelic League and the Irish Volunteers later, so as to be able to influence them for the outcome of events. Now Pearse is also shown there as a barrister, but in fact I think he only ever represented anybody in one hearing. Now the people I mentioned earlier then, Peadar Bracken and Seamus O'Brennan, this is a picture of Peadar Bracken here when he, in 1904, just after before he left for Australia. As you know, some of you know, he was from Shra. His family are originally from Tipperary. He was from a stonecutter family, and he was very much more radical than a lot of his colleagues in the Gaelic League and the Celtic Literary Society, and went on to, when he came back in 1914, to take an immediately prominent role in activities locally. Now, I'm not sure about this man here, I think, was pointed out to us the other night at a talk in the library on the O'Brennans as being Seamus O'Brennan. And that's a significant photograph in that it's of the Pipers Band in Tullamore, which was founded in 1911 and which was, represents a strong development of cultural nationalism at the time. It was supported by some of the bigwigs in Ireland, Alice Stopford Green, whom we'll see later, and also by F.J. Bigger, who was prominent from Belfast and who was prominent in Irish cultural movements. Now there are rather references to the fact that he liked to have a lot of boys running around the house in kilts, but we don't have any real evidence of anything unsavoury about him, so I just merely mention it in passing. Now, how was it received at national level? How was this incident received at national level? There seems to be mixed views on that. Charles Wise Power, the barrister, the junior counsel, who represented the Tullamore 15 at their court hearings and at their court martial, took the view that, quoting from Clark and McDermott, that they had been unhappy with the event in Tullamore and felt that the volunteers had lost their temper and fired on the police. Now perhaps that was because both Clark and McDermott were the key people in the rising and the people who above all else saw that it happened. And they may not have wanted any local development to interfere with the possibility of the rising, and certainly didn't want any leaders to be arrested in advance of Easter Sunday. Now another view then is the one that was put forward recently, but it's based on evidence apparently of a spy in the camp, so that possibly this was the view that maybe if the police had crossed the threshold, or they shouldn't have crossed the threshold, and they should have been shot before they did so. When I say the threshold, I mean the rooms in William Street. Now that view, I find difficulty with, in that it was reported by a spy, and perhaps it was buttered up for the fact that he was being paid, maybe not by the word like us lawyers, but certainly by the value of the information being conveyed. Barton and Foy, who have done a history of 1916, a good one, said that the shots at Tullamore were in a sense the first shots in the Easter Rising, in that the Tullamore incident, while not engineered, was helpful to the military council in the argument that government raids would be met by resistance and bloodshed. And in many ways that reiterates what Pearse is said to have spoken to Seamus O'Brennan. And Marcus Bourke makes the same point in his Life of O'Reilly, so that you have these balancing acts, if you like, as between what Wise Power said in 1947 and what these other people say. But I have also to tell you that in all the general surveys of 1916, you won't find many references to Tullamore. I hope I don't puncture too many self-esteems there, but in fact that is the situation. Barton and Foy and O'Reilly are among the very few. Robert Key, thank you, yeah. But very few overall, but certainly none of the recent publications have said a great deal about it. And the leaders themselves, we've just spoken about them. Clark there was the most prominent and the most forceful, and certainly aided by MacDiarmid. And people like MacDonough apparently were kept in the cold right up to very close to the point of the rebellion. Connolly, of course, was very forceful, but if you look at O'Casey's plays, like The Shadow of the Gunman and Juno and the Paycock and so on, you will see that O'Casey felt that Connolly was disloyal to his socialist ideals by pursuing a nationalist agenda in 1916. Now, who were the men running the country? If you take we don't like to get in too much into the modern day, but if you take Sunningdale and also the 1997 agreements, people at the very top do matter in making decisions. And you can see here Asquith is on your left there, and then in the middle is Augustine Birrell, who was by all accounts one of the best chief secretaries we had, but also the one who was rather summarily dismissed in 1916, and a man who didn't really want the job, but took it and stayed with it as he was loyal to Asquith and Asquith to him. And then you have the most wily of all the politicians of the 20th century, Lloyd George. And he came to Ireland after the rebellion to try and bring about a solution. But of course we were unwilling to accept partition at that time. And once the news broke of a possibility of permanent partition, the effort was out. And it lost a lot of credibility for Redmond at the time. Now the others then, you can see Redmond there on the one side, and the other, the Irish leaders now. Redmond was there of the United Parliamentary Party from the 1900s, commanded very wide support in Ireland up to 1916, began to lose it after that. His right-hand man then was James Dillon, who made an impassioned plea in the House of Commons in May or June of 1916, saw that the executions would lead to rivers of blood, and himself lost his seat then in 1918. The man in the middle is, of course, the man who in many ways is responsible for so much in Ireland, and that's Edward Carson, a Dublin man who went north and was the backbone behind the northern reluctance, indefatigable reluctance really, to avoid home rule. And beside him is his supporter-in-chief, Bonar Law, who also had Ulster ancestry. And in many ways, it was his starting of the volunteers in the north of Ireland in January of 1913 that led to the formation of the Irish Volunteers that November. Now, who were the big wigs at local level? Well, they were all influential people for a period until 1920, when there were great changes, of course, following the elections. But you can see there in the middle Henry Egan, whose family were very strong in Tullamore, and whose wife was the first, or whose daughter, I should say, one of them, was the first president of the Commemoration in Tullamore. You can see beside over here William Adams, the father of P.F. Adams, and over here you can see little Michael Reddy, who was an Irish parliamentary MP and had to speak for recruitment in 1914, and suffered as a result and lost his seat in 1918. And over here the other MP, another interesting character, whose granddaughter is here this evening, and that's E.J. Graham. And he managed to ride both horses, if you like, in that he was able to look after his parliamentary party supporters and to meet the protest of the separatists after May of 1916. Unfortunately, he died in March of 1918, and as he came in a by-election, he also caused a by-election in 1918 by his early death. So locally then, we had another lot of prominent people. This is P.F. Adams here, who was defeated in the December 1914 by-election. This is the chairman of the council in May 1916, Patrick Egan, who was a son of Henry Egan, who had been chairman of the county council, and this was his son as chairman of the urban council. He later became a TD here in Laois Offaly for a short period. And beside him is, over here is Malachy Scally, who was a great nationalist, and whose wife was a daughter of John Fitzgibbon, the parliamentary MP in Roscommon. And up here you have Daniel Williams, who was a son of Daniel E. Williams. And it was Daniel E. Williams who gave a job to the injured policeman when he was discharged from the force after the incident in Tullamore. And then at the bottom we have, I think that's the man, he's Dixon is his name, and he was a maltster. And interestingly, the council had during the Home Rule build-up in 1913-14, J. Lumley was the here he is, that's why it's here. He was the chairman of the council. And in Tullamore here we were able to tell our northern friends that we were very liberal in that we had a Methodist as chairman of our town council in 1914, and that therefore they had no fears by coming into United Ireland. Now he moved on as chairman in favour of Pat Egan in 1915, but both men had family friends at the front, and you can see why that council was, readily disposed in terms of mentality to immediately condemn the rising in May of 1916. And very fortunately, the minute book of that incident has now been preserved and is available for all to see in the county library. So interesting mix-up there in people. But what I suppose I do want to say is that the council was very much middle class. And as we'll see in a moment, the participants in the incident were much more likely to be working class or lower middle class. Now, the other key thing to remember is that there would not have been any 1916 without the World War. I'm sure you've all heard that, but maybe you haven't. But if you haven't, I want to repeat it tonight, that there be no question of this rebellion or rising. Rebellion is what it was called at the time. Rising is what we call it since. All these words have meanings, and rising means that we were the downtrodden people, whereas rebellion means that we were upstarts, rebelling against the crown. But it was called the rebellion for most commentators at the time. Now, some people looking in from abroad, like Lenin, thought we were a little bit premature, and that we should have waited until the end of the war to bring about to bring about the end of a class-ridden society. Cruiser Browne writes about that very interestingly, as he would. And of course, a very good time to have had the rebellion would have been in the time of the conscription crisis in 1918, when both church and state, at least in Ireland, came together to oppose conscription. And there was a very united front in Ireland against conscription. And of course, a lot of people will argue that incidents like Tullamore and protest were caused by the fact that people did not want to be conscripted into the army. I wouldn't agree with that, but that's a view that you will hear. So now, access, can you do all this yourself? Yes, you can. There's no great magic about doing this type of research. Today now, with two very good collections in Tullamore here, apart from what's on the internet, you can do your own research. And all the witness statements are online, or a lot of them anyway, and you can look at them yourselves at home. So if you want to check on anything I say tonight, please do. So coming on then to just commemoration of the event afterwards, there were some references which were brought to my attention this week to the first shot theme in the 1930s. But very largely, the people who participated in the incident were seldom if ever referred to it in that matter. It was always much more gently called a prelude. The incident was called a prelude to the rising. And when we had celebrations, as in 1949, with the unveiling of a monument to Matthew Cain, who had been killed by the Black and Tans during the Anglo-Irish War. That was celebrated in Muplin. You can see the famous clergyman here, Father Burbage, and as a younger man here, and James Clark, who participated in the incident in 1960, supervising the salute there. Father Burbage was quite a strong character, and there were several radical priests in Offaly. And when you come to study 1917, which is in many ways more interesting than 1916 as far as we're concerned, you will see the growth of Sinn Féin, and you can mark its development in parishes where there were radical clergy. Tullamore is quite different in that respect, in that Father Callery, our parish priest, was distinctly conservative. And in fact, his biggest concern at the end of 1916 was people were putting artificial flowers on the graves in the cemetery, and it was going to be outlawed from here on. So there you go. So the other monument then that was unveiled was the major one in front of the courthouse here, a significant place as well, in that this was the seat of British power. And when the judges came to Offaly, or King's County as it then was, they were always driven ceremonially to the courthouse. So in effect, placing the monument here was, if you like, to say that we succeeded in bringing about a change of government, which of course we did. And that monument did not come without difficulty, in that Padre Bracken had arranged it with the County Council in 1937, and by 1939, with the help of American money, it was erected. But it took another 14 years to get agreement on its being unveiled with the soldiers in both sides of the Civil War coming together. But even on that day, no speeches were made, which shows you how difficult it was to talk about the previous 40 years. And some of the old soldiers again here of the time. I don't know how many of you were here in 1966, and probably very few looking around the audience tonight. Now there you were, if you were reading the Offaly Independent in 1966, you'd see there the plaque to be unveiled where the first shots were fired. I have to say in this regard, generally the reporters in the media tended to not read the small print of what the participants were saying, and tended rather to favour bigger headlines, which is nothing unusual today. And you can see the building here, Noel O'Brien's, was the place at that stage where the incident was recorded. And here's the very respectful and untriumphant reading. In proud memory of Tullamore volunteers' determined resistance against disarmament by British Crown forces, a prelude of Easter Rising, in which Tullamore was nobly represented. I wondered did the man who carved it leave out the definite article there, as sometimes happens, but maybe not. 11/4/1966. So that was the report then of the event. It was a very big affair, but of course it is an unquestioning event, in the sense that there were still a lot of people alive who were involved, or they were of a great age and very venerated, and there was very little critical study of the period in 1966. There were a few. John J. Horgan had written quite a firecracker in 1949, but mostly they came out in 1967 and 68 with books of essays which looked at the subject. And then after 1970, of course, and after 69, when the trouble started in the north of Ireland, there was really little or nothing until 2006. So we had one good publication at the time, which was reprinted this week, and I'm glad to see that Jeff Oakley, was one of the reporters for that, and he's very much to the good here, and Buddy Burke was the other, and James I. Fanning. Now, I'm moving on now briefly to the cultural side of it. The Abbey Theatre, of course, is important in the plays it put on from the 1900s. More recent commentary Roy Foster's book I would recommend to you. Some would regard him as a revisionist, but if you read lots of different ones, you may come to your own conclusions. But it's certainly an innovative approach in that book. Some of the people involved then who gave ideas which led to the rebellion. Standish O'Grady is probably the best known. He was a unionist, but he wrote a lot about Cuchulainn and about the mythological view of Irish history. And as Professor John Kelleher said one time, the Irish prefer to take their history in mythological form rather than in documentary. And Standish O'Grady would have dreaded the 1916 Rising, but hard to believe his writings formed the basis of Pearse's views on the mighty Irish and the place of Cuchulainn, both in history and in his own school. Now over here then was George Russell, who was a more practical person and supported the development of cooperation and wrote some important publications on it, and was eventually adopted by Roosevelt's America in the 1930s. Yeats, of course, was a major player in events, but by 1916 had got a little conservative and delayed publishing his famous poem for a while. O'Donovan Rossa, of course, this is John O'Leary, was another great figurehead for the nationalist movement, and Lady Gregory. And I've left out there O'Donovan Rossa, at least for the moment. Now locally then, how did that percolate down to Tullamore, where we're interested in? And you can see here the beginning of Irish Ireland in the development of Gaelic games, for example. In the 1880s we had an athletics ground at Spollenstown, but it was favoured by all and largely by the Protestant community, so that wouldn't be acceptable, and eventually Gaelic grounds were obtained, and Dick Barry here, who went off to America in 1904, has given us a very interesting account of the Celtic Literary Society here in the 1890s to the early 1900s, and that's an area that needs to be studied, just the cultural background. People like Henry Egan, another Egan in the family, if you like. I wonder how would he have behaved if he'd been around in 1916. It'd be interesting to know and speculate. But he died at age 29, and he's responsible for at least 2 publications, one of which was Ardna Hearn. And I venture to think that his inscription in the cemetery in Clonminch is one of the first in the Gaelic language in that cemetery, here in where his father is buried as you go into the cemetery. And over here then you have a group connected with the Gaelic League. We're not absolutely certain, but it may include John Mahon, who was an accountant with the County Council, and also Frank O'Loughlin, I think his name is here in the front row. Again, as I said, I think that period of 1900 to 1916 bears close examination. Another group then are the foresters. They are, if you like, men who came together in the kind of a clubbable fashion. They weren't full of nationalist ideas, but at the same time they were perceived as being nationalist, because as you may know, their hall was burned by the Black and Tans in 1920 in the aftermath of Sergeant Cronin's shooting. And their hall was used as a venue, of course, for many events in the meeting rooms in the period up to 1920. But like a lot of other Irish people, they were quite happy to collect money, and they were showing a lot of war films, for example, and war footage during the years of the First War for their patrons. So it's another group that bears closer study. Now I think this is one that's interesting to show how radical some groups were. The Midland Tribune was a very radical paper at that time. It had been founded as a Land League paper in 1881. The Tullamore Tribune is an offshoot of it from 1978. But in the first 30 years of its existence, it was very radical. And it didn't approve of the volunteers splitting up and some of them going into the war. It said that the volunteers was established to maintain the position of home rule in Ireland. Now why I want to mention that to you is because you can see here, this is John Powell, who was the editor of the newspaper, This is taken in Byrne, by the way, maybe I didn't say that to you, the Martyrs Memorial in Byrne, and it's in 1894. I have to acknowledge Amanda Pedlow's help in getting this very large format picture for you. It's a great picture, I think, showing a major national event. And for Jim Cullen down there, I'm mentioning to him, you can see the influence of American money. You see the flag there. So I'm sure it was supported by American funds at the time. Now, it's not a great reproduction, but you can just see there O'Donovan Rossett. And here's, he has the cable in his hand, pulling off the cloth. And this is another view of Powell here. Very unfortunately, if ever a man needed to be venerated, it's this man, in that he gave all his life in Offaly for his 20 years here to the nationalist cause. And he died in 1901, and he had been imprisoned many times during that period. And he was vice chairman of the council when he died, but it's strange how history works out. He's forgotten now, and I think he's very much deserving of a study. Now, I mentioned the Celtic Literary Society a minute ago. Sometimes there was a degree of sameness between these organisations, in that they often had the same personnel and they blended into each other. And that might be the way with the Celtic Literary Society and the Gaelic League. The Gaelic League, of course, was supposedly non-political until about 1913. And as you know, Douglas Hyde resigned from the movement at that point because he protested against its politicisation by the IRB. Anyway, our friend Richard Barry, who wrote an account for us of the society, is here, but he went to America in 1904, and he didn't come back for work here. He did visit quite a bit, and he was friendly with Hugh Daigan, whose family is here this evening. And this is John Forrestal, and we can thank John for the place names of the streets here in Tullamore. The Gaelic League was responsible for changing the names of the streets in 1905, and that's why you have, where did the incident take place in Tullamore, does anybody know? You're all very good. I thought somebody would say William Street, but, but no, because of course it took many years for these changes to be accepted. And I know when I was a youngster in school in the 60s, we still called Patrick Street Barrack Street, much to the annoyance of Brother S.R. O'Giffney, who was very pro-nationalist. We didn't know about these things at the time. Sorry. So this is Gerald O'Loughlin, another man who was in the organisation. And I mentioned the pipers earlier. They were another cultural fusion of the time, and an important one. And their rooms, their goods, their drums and their pipes were destroyed on the night of the incident. The crowd went after them and got in through the roof after they had pillaged the rooms in Columkill Street. And I just show you there Alice Stopworth Green, because she was quite a well-to-do widow who helped fund the arms coming in on the Asgard. But perhaps it's less known that she also helped to pay for the lovely banner of St. Columkill there that the band had, and along with F.J. Bigger. And she also took a prominent role in Durrow, that place that we haven't been able to resolve fully yet in terms of access. She wondered where the Nettles, Protestant Nettles, in 1914, or why weren't we about getting it sorted out? You know, it was owned by the RCV at the time. Now I mentioned some of the other leaders of the cultural movement. Owen MacNeill, of course, some people said he was really a parliamentarian stroke nationalist volunteer rather than Irish volunteer, and he's the man who countermanded the rebellion on Easter Sunday by sending people in cars and taxis all across the country to tell the volunteers, the Irish volunteers, to stay at home. And Douglas Hyde then is in the centre and was very much the cultural father of the Gaelic League, and ironically then he became President of Ireland under De Valera for a period in the 1940s. And beside that then is E.J. Graham, who, as I said earlier, but managed to keep a foot in both camps after 1916, until his early death, and was prominent in raising questions in the House of Commons about the Tullamore incident case. So now, how was Tullamore at the time? Tullamore was a good business town at that time. It had a population of about 5,000 people, which is about what is it today, 14 to 15,000. Everybody lived within the confines of the railway and the canal, you could say. And Egan's were one of the most prominent families. Maybe they weren't so wealthy as Williams's, but they were certainly very prominent in politics and in national life. The hotel then is, you recognise it there, the old Hayes' Hotel. And it was here in this town then that the the Irish Volunteers were formed in 1914, in April of 1914. And many people, one in particular because he's going to publish a book on it, sees it as one of the most significant organisations in the 20th century. And again, not unremarkably, we don't have any articles yet published, I think, on the volunteers in Offaly. I mentioned Carson there and his example in the north of Ireland, and here he is taking salutes and all the rest of it here in Ulster at the time of the Covenant in September. Now Carson, of course, was on the Conservative side, and very soon the Liberal government in 1914 discovered how ineffectual they might be if there was a civil war in Ireland, which people thought there would be, don't forget. 1916, and the war rather, while it brought us the rebellion of 1916, it actually possibly saved us from a civil war between North and South, which would have killed a lot more people. And one of the backgrounds to that was the Corra incident, the Corra mutiny it's sometimes called, where officers in the British Army declined to be sent north and preferred to resign rather than go north. And you can see here how well armed the Ulster Volunteers were, and of course, as you know, they imported a very significant amount of arms in April of 1914. And we followed suit then in August. But around the same time as they were importing the arms in the north of Ireland, we were forming the Volunteers here in the south, here in Tullamore, I should say. The Volunteers had been formed in November in Dublin and percolated across the country very quickly. It caught on. It was a very significant, movement, and surprisingly, it caught on very quickly. Notwithstanding, at that time, communications were dependent only on the newspapers. There was no other method of communicating one's ideas, except by speechifying or by writing about it and having it circulated. So we do know who most of these people were in the Volunteers. Dr. O'Regan there was a tuberculosis doctor for the county, for example. What I'm trying to tell you is that there was very much a mix of middle class and working class. The Pipers are over here in the background, and the four O'Brennan brothers were members of that, and as I said, founded in 1911, and very much available for all national events thereafter. The courthouse was where the main inauguration took place, addressed by Roger Casement, who was executed in July of 1916, and who came to Ireland to what? He came to say the rebellion was off, and that there was going to be no German guns and the time wasn't appropriate for it. And the other man who addressed it was Tom Kettle, who was himself killed then in the war and knew that his life had been somewhat wasted by the side that he had taken. So that's summer weather, a bit like today. A parade took place prior to the meeting, headed by Tullamore and Athlone Pipers Band, and goes on to describe all the contingents from round the county. The town was profusely decorated, and the principal streets were spanned with bunting, flags and appropriate national scrolls. And who was speaking? P.F. Adams, White and Clara, who was a great nationalist, and the chair was taken by John Dooley, who was from Byrne and who supported recruitment in the war as a great nationalist, and then lost his position as chairman of the council in 1918. And Roger Casement went on to say that the fact that he was an Ulster Protestant and once a British officer had not impaired the fact that he was first of all an Irishman. So I hope you all feel like that today. And interestingly, they called on the volunteers of 1782 as inspiration, which of course would be anathema to nationalists after 1916. The idea that Grattan's Parliament meant anything in nationalist terms would have been totally eradicated after 1916. So, and even Lawrence Parsons was mentioned in a speech. So it's interesting how ideas evolve. Now that would be somewhat based on Arthur Griffith's ideas of nationalism at the time. The volunteers did take great traction, as I said, and that's a presentation to Redmond at Maryborough or Portlaoise about August or July of 1914. And the day was coming then in August when the war was declared, and everybody in Ireland, north and south, Protestant and Catholic, well, nearly everybody, 90% of them, got together to support the war effort. And there was lots of stuff in the newspapers about Protestant landlords and Catholic tenants all enrolling together, and Protestants joined the volunteer movement, loads of them, and there was generally great fraternisation. And if you like, that was a credit to Redmond in that he felt that by participating in the war, he would bring about a united Ireland by common solidarity between Protestant and Catholic, north and south, fighting the German invader and the Germans who had invaded the Catholic country in Belgium. And of course that the war would be over by Christmas. That was the real issue. Everybody thought it would be a short war. Now you can't see much of that because I don't know how many of you can identify, I've said it to you, the railway station. You can see the Tullamore jail in the background. And that's just taken from the newspaper. And you can see all the volunteers lined up. And who were they wishing away? Their commanders. These were the people who had drilled and shown them how to train. And they were mainly reservists in the army. And as soon as the war was declared, they headed off to the front. And of course, as a result of that, the volunteers as a body lost their most experienced people. And of course, Redmond's speech might have been acceptable had he confined it to that, but of course he didn't. At his Woodenbridge speech in September of 1914, he suggested that it would be appropriate for people to participate in the war, not just by defending Ireland, but by going to Europe and fighting the Hun in his own country and defending Catholic Belgium. It was a ring that was taken up by the church as well, and by a lot of people in Ireland because they were Catholic and felt that they were doing the right thing to go to Belgium. Now there was dissension. I have a funny feeling this letter was written by Ella Brennan, but I can't prove it. But it's an entertaining letter written to say that in the past couple of days, what can only be described as a malignant attempt, prompted no doubt by petty jealousy, is being made by a few people in Tullamore to break up the National Volunteers. One of these is notably a gentleman who will be better employed in pursuit of escaped ammonia, of which there is an abundance, I'm sorry to say, in the township, and that he's paid handsomely from the coffers of the Urban Council for strutting about with the air of a burgomaster, and poking his nose into affairs with which he has no immediate concern. These are nice letters, aren't they? We don't get those sort of letters in the press anymore, for very good reasons, I suppose. But in any case, he was talking about a united volunteers at that stage. But by September, after the speech, things were changing, and you had division in the volunteers, with the original Irish volunteers deciding to expel the pro-Redmond majority. Now, about 90% across the country of the volunteers stayed with Redmond, and 10% stayed with the Irish volunteers. It varies. Byrne was more prominent in the Irish volunteers, and so also was Tullamore, but not Dangan or Edenderry. So there are interesting nuances, and they are related really. Say the Tribune was in Byrne, and Val Powell was there In Tullamore you had the O'Brennans and Paddy Bracken and others who were all who were prominent here. Now in all of that, just as we were leaving in October 1914, we were leaving, the main body of nationalists were staying with Redmond and were very much based on middle class leadership. And then comes an election to take our attention away from the war. We had the first by-election of the war in Kings County in Tullamore here in December of 1914. And in the camps were P.F. Adams. I did have a younger photograph of him, but it wasn't great quality. That's him in 1930s. But beside that is his father. And this is his opponent, E.J. Graham here. And E.J. Graham won the election by 79 votes. So for the months of October, November, December, Tullamore was totally taken up with the by-election. And of course it was a defeat for Redmond, or was perceived as such, although really it was a win for localism, because E.J. Graham was very well got and was backed by D.E. Williams, and they had a lot of clout in Tullamore at the time. Now if this man with the white beard had been alive, he wouldn't have won, I'm pretty confident. That's William Adams. And he was the senior political figure in Tullamore for 40 years. But his death in August of 1914 robbed his son of his biggest supporter. And as a result, Graham won the by-election. Now, if any of you are going into politics for the next election, you will see here, when voting for Graham, Redmond's favourite, mark your paper as under. Now, of course, he wasn't Redmond's favourite, but somehow or other he must have picked up that phrase from one time or another and managed to put it on the ballot, or managed to put it on the voting, on the replica voting card. So Seamus O'Brien then, when all of that politics fell away, we had another issue, and that was the Geishel cattle drive. The Geishel cattle drive took place in October, I think it was, of 1914, and there were 46 people involved. This was driving cattle, in case any of you don't know what it is. It was driving cattle off a landlord's land to try and get that land to be divided for the tenants. And especially the landless people who had no tenancies at all, who hadn't benefited under the Land Acts and didn't have a stake in the country. And 46 of them were arrested as a result of an attack on the police. But who fired the first shot? Paddy Bracken. The only shot that was fired that day. And my belief is that when Inspector Crane went into the hall in Tullamore in March of 1916 and saw Bracken, he immediately went a bit berserk and gave an instruction that they were all to down arms. And that led to the melee. Anyway, that's my own thinking, but if you want to talk about the first shot, that's where I'd say it was actually fired initially, followed on then by the March incident. Seamus O'Brien I mentioned just in passing to say that in 1915 he wrote to the local papers pleading with the volunteers who had stayed with Redmond to think about coming back into the Irish fold, and he quoted a nation once again there near the end of his piece, and told them not to be conned by the British imperialists, and that they were really fighting for the empire. Now you know Lord Kitchener, you all know that, but you can see in the other notice there, these were published in the local press, and it mentions the money. You will be fed, clothed and boarded, and your pay will be £1 per day. Married men will receive the same, to a deduction of 6pence, which goes to their wives, entitling them to receive 12 shillings and 6 per week, and 5 shillings for one child. So fecundity did pay off. And the dependents of unmarried soldiers would also receive substantial allowances. So there was good money involved in joining the army, and I would think that a lot of people in Tullamore joined for that purpose, because they didn't have work, and because money was scarce, jobs were scarce, and wages didn't much exceed 12 shillings per week for a lot of ordinary working people. That's another advert there, albeit from a unionist supporting paper. But I expect the press were paid in 1915, early 1916, to carry all these notices and photographs of men at the front, which they did. And you can see these galleries of heroes. They were actually published by the Tullamore and Kings County Independent in November in 1915. And what they show are lots of Tullamore people who were at the front. For example, some of the supporters of the British Army lived in Davitt Street in Tullamore, because there were 9 or 10 people there who were at the front. Andy O'Brien, or some of you may remember Andy O'Brien, he was a prominent here in Tullamore. He's here as number 1. He survived the war. And then you had 3 Lumley sons of the former chairman of the council. You had a brother or 2 of Pat Egan, and lots of others. And it will be very interesting to find out where all these people were, and where and what connection they have with the women who were protesting in March of 1916. Now, what did the end of the year say before we reached 1916? And the King's County Independent, it was rather a dull year, in the sense that they noted that there was a ball in the Foresters' Hall attended by E.J. Graham, and that there was a lot of collecting for soldiers at the front and prisoners of war, and that there had been successful recruiting meetings. Now, this was the same paper. You wouldn't recognise this paper a year later, in that it had totally changed its tune on the war. But the other thing was, it suffered from amnesia. The editor suffered from amnesia, in that he never remembered what he had been writing up to May of 1916. He does mention in the end there the report of cases of drunkenness of separation women, including a woman in Portlaoise who said that her husband was only after coming out from the Dardanelles, and she was in receipt of a separation allowance of 23 shillings. The magistrate said he was going to put down this business of soldiers' wives spending the money they get from the country in drink. There was a lot of that went on in reporting at the time. There was a women's movement, of course, as you know, but the women's movement of the suffragettes was largely upper class and middle class women, and there were very few working class women. And it's my contention that in this 1916 episode, the case of the women who were protesting has never been addressed, and that they never had a voice in all of these discussions that we're having this evening, or the limited discussions that we've had in the past. So here's the locus again of the event. William Street, a very fine looking town at that time. Lovely new building there of Malachy Scally, the drapery store, and lovely new restaurant there of English's on the other corner. And another view of it there again, very, very fine. Malachy Scally lost a window. You can see these lovely big windows. He lost one of those in the shootout. And here it is. I won't go into the detail, but it's very, very well turned out. The barrack then was nearby and was in the police barrack was in the old military barrack. And you can see it at the end of the street. It was there from 1716 to 1922, when it was destroyed as the Republican forces were leaving Tullamore. You can see the prominent Daniel E. Williams building also. Now you can see the homes of the working classes, and you can see Pensioners Row there, the one with the cart in front of it. These people were living O'Malloy Street, as we call it now. Hollywood was what it was called when I was a child. Before that it was Pensioners Row. Pensioners because there were pensioners from the Napoleonic Wars of 100 years earlier who had been settled there. On the other side we have Quarry View, or Clontarf Road it became, Tinkers Row before that. You can see the new church of 1906 in the background, and the bonded warehouse, Tullamore Jew Centre, and across the street all the thatched houses where Mr. Michael Clark lived, who was the father of Jimmy Clark, and a Mr. not Graham, but another man lived there who was also involved in the incident. And behind that is the workhouse. And the workhouse, you could keep 300 people in the workhouse for the price of one person now per week in a nursing home. So you can see they only got a slice of bread and butter for their fee. These are all other things that we could be studying, of course. So coming to the incident itself, it was a bit of a joke in the 60s in that they used to talk about a heron being shot instead of a crane, which was a play on the two key people involved, Sergeant Ahern and Inspector Crane. It was, as I said, the things that are below that I've mentioned already. The street itself, we've mentioned where the policeman is there and the other people. Now you see the building again, for those of you who like geography. You see the building there again, Kelly's it was in the 60s, a drapery store. And then it became, oh yes, Frank Mahan gave me this lovely picture to show our town in the late 50s for any of the children here in the audience who don't realise that we had a fair day once a month, and that we sold pigs and cattle and sheep on the streets, and that it took us 50 years to change that from having it on the street to somewhere else. Noel O'Brien's then the modernised drapery store where, you may remember it as a place where you could go in and get 4 or 5 suits, and instead of trying them on in the shop you could bring them home and try them on at home. And then when your mother was satisfied with what you brought, you could change it. Anyway, that's an aside. So Sergeant Ahern was the only person injured, and the Offaly Independent, I'm sorry to tell you, the contemporary report said it was much ado about nothing. And it is to be deplored that this efficient and able policeman, of whom everyone speaks so highly in Tullamore, should have suffered such bodily harm and be the victim of a scuffle that should never have taken place. And then I'm sorry to tell you, we are glad to say neither from a political or military point of view has this occurrence we report today the smallest significance. And it goes on to talk about how it arose and the differences in the community and the cry of down with Sinn Féiners and so on. And then the incident reflected tensions in the town on the part of the families, 500 we reckon, maybe a little bit less, maybe more. Second, many of the young volunteers were of poor education. Don't forget we had no second level schools in Tullamore at that time. We did have by 1912, I say. But for those men who participated in this incident, they didn't have the benefit of any opportunities. The nationalists were frustrated because, of course, Home Rule was on the statute book, but postponed. And then you had Carson in the north stirring it up, and yet he was made Attorney General of England in 1915, although he was committing treason in 1930. So you can see that there was a long build-up of frustration in the nationalist camp. And then the police themselves were suffering from their own job difficulties. And then you had the people in town. The farmers did well out of the war, but people in the town didn't. They suffered from the privations of war. The biggest one being that they were uncertain as to whether their menfolk were going to come home dead or injured. And they wouldn't come home, of course, if they died, but there'd be a plaque for them, a bronze plaque. The affray itself then, that's the picture of it there, of the scene, and you can see here Head Constable Stewart, our friend Sergeant Ahern, and Inspector Crane here on the right. So that's the reporting of it. The photographs were taken by the Irish Independent. The report itself there, out of hand, rival factions in Tullamore, Sinn Féiners fare badly, attacked in their own hall, many missiles thrown. So it was a big affair for a local town. Now the comments I've already mentioned, Pearse of course reported by Seamus O'Brennan to have eulogised the event. Owen MacNeill was, if you like, was certainly founded. That's my own phone, I should turn that off. That's like the judge giving out about people in court and then his phone goes out. Owen MacNeill found it was helpful to him in that the week before the rebellion, he seesawed between whether he'd let it go ahead or not. And then the O'Rahilly was very much a supporter. And Bulmer Hobson, who of course you all know was very much sidetracked after 1916, he wrote there that a large crowd, and principally from the Barrack Street quarter of Tullamore, i.e., that's my brackets now, Kilbride Street and O'Malloy Street and lanes adjoining, assembled outside the rooms occupied by the local volunteers. Several volunteers and also several ladies. This is the point I made earlier. There is a class dimension to this incident as much as there is a nationalist dimension. Bad blood brewing between the rival factions in Tullamore, the poorer working class people who have fathers, sons and other near relatives in the army and at the front fighting for their country. And the Offaly Independent was supportive in many ways in that it didn't agree that those in the room were pro-German or anti-war. Well, they were anti-war, but pro-German principally, but it felt that they were also loyal to their country and they were motivated by loyalty. And in history, of course, our aim isn't to praise or blame anybody. Our aim is to explain insofar as we can and to avoid bias. Now, there's a mention here of the girls, this would be the Sinn Féin, from an early hour of the morning were engaged in selling volunteer badges or tricolours through the town. And when the trains arrived bringing the Dublin and Leeds team, they sold a lot of them. And they were accompanied by volunteers, by male volunteers. And there was a disagreement. Two of the Sinn Féin girls approached a young man who was sporting the red, white and blue of the Allies and asked him to buy a badge. He declined and they indulged in some pertness. That's a nice word, isn't it? This young fellow was later threatened to be assaulted by one of the Sinn Féin crowd. Now some reports say a gun was pulled on somebody, but not in this little statement anyway. And there was also a feeling that a man who was on the Leinster Council of the GEA and who was a member of the local GEA board or club, there was attempts being made to oust him from the Leinster Council, and that did go ahead, a man by the name of Condren. So there are a lot of interesting little things going on. The picture on the other side is not Tullamore, but it's to show you the separation women gathering to get the weekly pension. Now the prisoners, of course, were on remand for 3 months. They were brought to Tullamore prison, and Walter Callan was the magistrate. He would prefer to have the public in court, but very quickly the military and police authorities decided that the public would be excluded, and the usual ring of steel, as our friend Paul Reynolds would say, surrounded the courthouse and the jail, and the prisoners were brought by the subterranean passage. So they were treated as high security prisoners from the beginning, and remained in Tullamore till after the rebellion, or the rising. You can see here the judges coming to court in all the panoply of that period. And then you can see where the prisoners were held in the prison in Tullamore. And below that where they were sent to Richmond prison after the rebellion. Now this was something I was messing with. Oh yeah, that's James, that's our friend Healy, the man who, remember he inquired in Parnell in the great meeting in 1890, in the, room 22 was it, about who was going to be the mistress of Ireland, and Parnell was the master. He was very much an anti-Parnellite, but he was also a great lawyer. And he, because the prisoners were removed from Tullamore to Dublin, they were taken out of the civil authorities and they were put into the military. And then there was legal argument about whether it was right that the prisoners could be tried by court-martial for an incident that had happened during the course of the civil law and before martial law was declared. Martial law was only declared on 28 April of 1916, and this incident had happened nearly 5 weeks earlier. Now, the solicitor was our friend James Rogers, who was a founder member of this society in 1938, but very sadly he never spoke about these incidents. He was alive in 1966, but he was, I don't know was he well or not, but there's no reference much to him. And of course he should have been on the podium in 1966 as the man who had defended all of the Sinn Féin prisoners in 1916. Wiley there with a nice wig was made a High Court judge in 1920, and he was the prosecutor for the government. And then we had General Blackadder, who was the man who was in charge of the court-martial. And of course, despite the representations of Healy and the reasonable attitude of Wiley, he was a very fair man. He prosecuted De Valera, and De Valera went on to appoint him a judge of the Irish High Court in 1920s. Notwithstanding their representations, Blackadder, of course, found the men guilty and gave them substantial sentences. What happened then was General Maxwell overturned or refused to confirm the convictions. Now, one of the people who was the junior counsel was our friend Charles Wise Power, the son of Jenny Wise Power. And he has left a valuable statement about Tullamore and other matters. He became a circuit court judge afterwards. And this is the charge sheet which had been given to us by the O'Brennan family. The original charge sheet names all the men involved. James O'Brennan, you won't be able to read it, Peter Bracken as he was called there, Frank Brennan, Thomas Byrne, John Delaney, James Clark of Clontarf Road, Joseph Morris of Crow Street, Henry McNally, Thomas Duggan, and Thomas, we'll have to, my writing, my eyesight's not that wonderful, of Barrack Street, Joseph Rafter, he later went to America. And their charges then are largely disaffection under the DORA or legislation, because at this stage the sergeant had made a recovery and there was no longer attempted murder. Now, there were 15 men in all, or some of them were young, very young men, and 3 of them were minors, and they were released before ever going to Dublin at all. They were released when they were in Tullamore. And the others then, 2 of them were detained after the rising. The men who had escaped in Tullamore, Bracken and O'Brennan, were released or were arrested after the rising and charged in relation to Tullamore. So that left 12. And they got sentences varying from 1 to 5 years. It was very heavy going. Now that's the parliamentary question from Graham in the House of Commons. It was essentially about martial law and civil law. And here's General Maxwell in the centre. He had already done in 15 people, and he, you know, we had a little chat about it the last night with Jim Cullen. But many people feel that Maxwell won 1916 for the rebels because of the heavy way in which it was handled. And that's a debatable point. The other man who gave such latitude to Maxwell was Asquith here. When Asquith came over in late May, he went to the Richmond, and much to the annoyance of some of the senior army people, he spoke to a number of the prisoners. Some say he spoke to the Tullamore people, some say he didn't. But he admired the eyes of some of the younger Sinn Féin boys who were there. And I know he was purely in the Homeric sense. And Maxwell wrote to him about the Tullamore incident, trial, and they agreed that it was not opportune to send these people to prison because it would test the law in relation to civil law and martial law and the arrest of these men and their being held. And they didn't want that particular case to be the undoing of their legal arguments in relation to whether prisoners could be held under martial law or not. And for that reason, it was nothing to do with the efficacy of Tim Healy or that, but maybe a little, that might be a bit uncharitable. But certainly it was political. And on the release of the Tullamore men, he wrote to General Maxwell, the military supremo, to agree with him on his release of the Tullamore men, as the legal case was, so far as I know, the only weak spot in our armour. Now, Asquith was himself a very good barrister, so he was fully appreciative of these arguments. Again, these are all the Tullamore men that were involved. I suppose it's been handled without the prince up to now. Joe Rafter there, who died in America. This is Joseph Graham from Whitehall. John Martin, Seamus O'Brennan, Peter Bracken, James Clark. James Kelly was not actually, he fought at Ashburn in 1916 and had a very good war, as you might say. Thomas Hogan here, John Spain, Edward Downs, you may remember the Downs family, John Delaney. Henry McNally was a clerk in Hoy and Denning afterwards. And according to some of them up there who were there a long time, tell me they never knew much about this episode in his life. Over there then are the names of all the people, stonecutters, clerks. There was no middle class people there, no people with property. They were all very much down the line property wise or money wise. Now the women then, we didn't mention them too much. First of all, Katie O'Brien, I don't know, does anybody know who she was? She wrote a nice little letter to the paper in 1966 to say that she had been in the hall 5 minutes before the first shot was fired, and yet she wasn't invited to the arrangements for 1966. So she wasn't too happy about that. Other names then there were two women supposedly escorted out of the hall during the time of the fracas. And we don't know who they were, but there are various names mentioned. The McBrines, these were Mrs. Paul and Mrs. Martin and Letty McBride. And there were other girls like Mary Mooney and Bridie Mooney. And there were three girls, the Berry girls, and the Neary sisters who lived across the street here, and Sarah Hogan. I know there is some research being done now on Commemoration in Tullamore and in Offaly, so hopefully that will unearth things. They had their first Cayley in the Foresters' Hall in December 1915, and all the names that we see with the incident are there. Peadar Bracken there, Henry McNally, and then a surprise one, Mrs. P.F. Adams was re-elected to the chair. So you can see that the nationalist constitutionalist and the nationalist separatist were still very much in evidence in the one camp. De Valera, of course, everything changed in 1917 with the victories, with the executions, and then the big wins in the by-elections. And De Valera came to Tullamore in late July or early August of 1917, and there was going to be a protest by the separation women, but there was nothing. It was a damp squib. And the same happened in 1918 at the time of the parliamentary party winning in Armagh, I think it was, in a by-election there in April of 1918. There was going to be a march around the town, led by P.F. Adams and another Captain Odlum. And again, that march, the Sinn Féin people cordoned off their part of the town, and the nationalist, constitutionalist went around the town to avoid Columkill Street. So you can see the memories of the incident were very green at that stage. Now, as I mentioned, there was a little bit of frivolity about the whole thing as well, and that's maybe a happy note to finish on. As I mentioned, some of the people in the war came from Davitt Street, which was a newish, very good quality street at that time because it had got new houses, 20 of them. And you can see the Quarry View houses below here. But anyway, Mrs. Mary Grogan, I hope there are no relations here, but Mrs. Mary Grogan took it upon herself to lead 50 women and boys to the house of Michael Clark in Clontarf Road or Quarry View. And the poem goes, in Tullamore some days ago there was a lively battle, and tufts of hair were flung around and women's tongues did rattle. Now what the fight was all about by no means seemeth clear, except that separation day brought with it some good cheer. Let this be true or just a fib, permit me to remark that Mrs. Mary Grogan offended Michael Clark by calling him all sorts of names, whilst loudly at him railing, and then by laying vicious hands upon his garden paling. So she took up his garden paling in disgust. His young boy had only been released from prison 2 weeks earlier. And when the case came to court then, by the way, this is James Clark here, who had been in the incident, and the O'Connells. And this one here is just to show you Davitt Street as it might have been some years back, as it was some years back. And anyway, the magistrates fined, she agreed to pay them, Mr. Clark, 10 shillings. But we got very good value in that the writer of this went on for 20 more verses to describe what had happened. So these other references I mentioned were the references in De Valera's time at the end of the war mention again the episode, but really after that there was very little about it except occasional references in the 30s, and then in 1950 it was suggested that a plaque be put up in Columkill Street, and that was not actually erected until 1966. And then I have to challenge you, how many people have ever even looked at it going by since? Now maybe you're to be excused, because if you notice the ones in O'Connell Street are also very high, near Thomas O'Clery's shop there. So it's not, when we talk about great things today, we've actually done a lot to ignore the story in the meantime. And it's only been brought home to us, not every year, but sometimes around Easter time, a relative of somebody who was involved might write a piece for the local press about it all. Anyway, I'd like to thank you for your forbearance. I'm a little 50, it's not too long, but I've enjoyed doing the research, and I think there's scope for us all, as I often advocate to you, to get involved and to use the library services that are available to you on the internet to do your own little bit of hunting. Our society is here to support you, and we're here to encourage you to do your research and to take an interest in your past. And it's far better to commemorate than to forget. And there's an awful lot of interesting material there in the stories of the volunteers. I've only been able to very sketchily outline it to you in this evening's talk, and I hope that you will bring to bear your own researches to sharpen up on what I've been saying tonight. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael, for recounting of that incident and the context, which I personally found very interesting anyway, and the whole background to it. Will you take questions?
I will. Yes, I will.
So if you have any questions now. One at the back there.
Whatever happened to Sergeant Ahern?
Very sadly, he was a casualty. He was discharged from the police force, and he got a job in the laundry of D. Williams, which was on Church Road, opposite Dunn's stores there. And then he moved to Banagher, to the Maltings, also owned by Williams. And he was knocked over by a lorry there in 1918 and killed. Now it wasn't malicious, but some of our members, Stephen McNeil here, tells me that he had lost his balance somewhat as a result of this incident. Stephen was unusually sympathetic to our policeman, and so he was a casualty. He was really the only. I know the men were locked up for 3 months, and in that verse I've just read bits of to you, in the court, Michael Clark was very clear to the judge that his son hadn't been convicted of anything, and the fact that they had been held on remand for 3 months and then released without any charge. So the policeman was the biggest casualty.
Any more questions?
What kind of schools did we have then? Was there a secondary school?
There wasn't. In fact, some of the witness statements say that the boys went to the brothers, but of course they couldn't have, because the brothers left town in 1892 in a little difficulty with the parish priest at the time, and didn't come back till they were invited back in 1912. So it wasn't possible that those boys, or very unlikely that they would have gone to St. Columba's. And anyway, St. Columba's at that time was very much for middle class boys, as it was a fee-paying school. This is the one where Bury Quay or Convent Road, where the De Montfort Hall apartments are nowadays. So that was very much a middle class school. It'd be the more the constitutional boys would have been going there at that time, and not the separatist. So that's where these statements need to be looked at carefully, because it's 30 years afterwards and people forget naturally some of the details. But there were no secondary schools until 1912, except you had to pay maybe to go to Tullamore out there, and that had closed anyway in the 1880s. But the Presentation Sisters were there, of course, for second level. And the nuns ran what they call a pension school, which was a kind of a school for paying middle class girls, but on a very small scale until about 1911, 1912. So there were very few opportunities. Emigration was at the same rate as it ran here in the last few years, 30,000. But most people were going to the States at that time, unlike later. States, of course, was closed off even to Irish people in the 1920s.
That was a very good talk.
Thank you very much, Philip.
Very insightful. It's a question about the crowd of the British Army supporters. You claim that you were unable to identify anyone. Did you ever hear
No.
of Matthew Kane or his family being involved in that?
No, I didn't see any names for the people involved. They were kind of the great unwashed, and they weren't dignified with the name. But also, of course, to answer Philip's question in more detail, the police weren't interested in them. And the point that maybe I didn't make forcefully enough tonight was that the police did nothing about the demonstrators, or very little, in the lead up to the difficulties. And the volunteers felt obliged to fire shots over their heads. Whether they lost their tempers, whether they were just bravado, whether it was genuine need, we don't know. But in any case, the police rushed the hall then instead of dealing with the demonstrators, and arrested people, and others got away. And then the crowd went in and broke up the place, and they did the same to the pipers. But we don't know, there were no one charged. And when you read the compensation claim, I didn't mention that, in October of 1916, Judge Drummond was very scathing of the police on day one. But on day two, as often happens in legal cases, everybody seemed to be talking off the one hymn sheet, and there was very little about what had happened. And it was really down to the money then. And the pipers got some money, and so did Malachy Scally, who was a constitutional nationalist, and so did the owner. The Chapman family were the owners of the leasehold in the building. Of course, the people involved got nothing. They had been arrested, so they got nothing out of it. There was no wrongful arrest or anything like that at that stage.
Was there a volunteer, Barry, he was sacked from?
There is a reference in one of the witness statements to yes, in the ladies. I don't know whether it's true or not. Malachy Scally would have. Now it would fit, because Malachy Scally was said very much a constitutional nationalist. His son-in-law had been killed in the war, and I think another one was to be killed also. One was a Jesuit, Fitzgibbon. And he suffered as a result of the war, so he's unlikely to have been very sympathetic to Sinn Féin supporters. And even when the incident happened, and for the 2 or 3 weeks immediately after it, tensions were high in Tullamore about it. And one group were putting on a play, with the secretary was a Mr. Johnson there from Harbour Street, that family. And he had to write to the paper to say that even though their play had a sound of "Wrap the Green Flag Round Me Boys" type title, they were distancing themselves from anything that had happened in the previous week, and they were not connected with it in any way. And then there was a send-up of Mr. Dixon. He was a councillor, I mentioned to him earlier, he was a mobster. And Dixon was also at pains to let the paper know that he had nothing to do with the incident, which of course he wouldn't have, because he was the county recruiting officer for the army in a voluntary capacity. So there were a few amusing send-ups, but things like that didn't often get printed. If you look at the newspapers today, how much of what you see and read, it reflects the reality of what's going on. And you need these witness statements and diaries to get people's innermost thoughts. But very unfortunately, we don't have diaries of working class people, because a lot of them were barely able to write, and they didn't have the financial means to do so. And there was no Facebook for them to put their thoughts in. So, you know Facebook? Does young girl know it? Well, it's a very good place to read people's thoughts today. So there you go. Any other questions?
Just a quick one, Michael. Can you recall, was that plaque put on the original shop? Nor O'Brien redeveloped his?
No, it was on the old shop, about 1971.
You could see it better.
Yeah, 71 or 77, but I think it was 71 Noel redeveloped it. Now maybe he did 2 developments, but it was in the 70s anyway.
77.
Yeah, it was the other one, yeah. So no, it needs to be lower down if we want to take more to be more, how would you say, vandal proof to survive.
Okay, what was the origin of the foresters? They seem to be dotted around the country with foresters' halls in various towns.
They were a benevolent society for not just a happy death, but one that where your funeral would be paid for, and you could save your money. That was one of the great reasons. The other was as a club, but that was the original idea, was a club, a working man's club, if you like. And it has survived, of course. It's one of the oldest clubs in Tullamore now, and it's not in the same place, but the original building was in Harbour Street, where the youth club is, and it was destroyed in 1920. It was a very go-ahead club, and it has the very best cinema in Tullamore in 1914. So it was central to people's lives at the time. But benevolent for everybody, and of course a late night drink, maybe, who knows.
Did you mention that in O'Connor Square, the monument there? I forget now.
Yeah, I didn't go near that, but that's interesting.
Yeah,
Because it shows who was calling the shots in the 1920s, to use an inapt word, in the sense that, the social revolution that never was a title of a famous article. And in 1924, when we reopened our circuit court, when we abolished the British legal system and brought in an Irish one, first of all, we copied the British very much. And secondly, the judge in the First Circuit Court had been a judge in the old British regime. And now he was popular, a man called Wakely. But who presented him with a vote of thanks on the day he arrived? But the same man who was the resident magistrate for the prisoners when they were detained in Tullamore in 1916. The man, what's his name? Anybody remember his name? We'll think of it in a minute. But anyway, this man, I'll tell you a little funny one. He got into hot water. After Tullamore, he was moved very quickly, which would suggest to me that he didn't handle the hearing properly. Callan was his name, Walter Callan. His father had been an MP up in County Louth. He may not have handled it very well in terms of what the politicians wanted, as opposed to law needs. And he was moved very quickly. And in 1920, the Black and Tans raided the house of a prominent lady, nationalist. And who did they find have a hot bath in her house? Only Walter Callan. So, and he was the man then who presented the first welcome, I suppose, to our circuit court judge. And he remained on in Tullamore as a barrister, briefed a lot by Hoy and Denning for the next 30 years. So it's interesting how, when you probe these things and see what happened to each person. James Rogers, who was a great defender of the Sinn Féin people in 1916, became the state solicitor in 1926 and the county registrar. And very sadly didn't commit to paper because he must have known so much more than others because he was a prominent local observer. He did leave letter books, by the way, which survived and are here in the society. They were rescued from his old office when Mr. Hunt had to retire suddenly in the 1980s. That's not a secret, it was in the press at the time. Everything was left, and we were lucky enough to be given what was remaining. So there are references in the letters there to this incident, mainly in brief discussions with council. Yes?
Michael, just to commend you first on your excellent talk, given in your own inimitable style. There's just 2 points. One's a local and one is more national. I think you mentioned there Mr. Egan. Was it Henry Egan?
Henry was the prominent businessman, yeah.
And he was in the Dáil, and I think he was on the verge of becoming our first cabinet minister.
He was. That was Pat Egan, his son.
Around 1924.
Yes. Time of the army crisis.
There was a bit of a hiccup at the time of the army crisis. And the point number 2 is I've always been intrigued by the whole phrase about home rule. And nowadays it's looked on as that sort of satisfied Ireland's desires back in the time when it was there. But I saw it described once as a glorified county council is what we would have had in Dublin. You know what I mean? Now that's a historical argument. You know what I mean? And someone else said it's even less than Wales has now in the UK. So I think it's a thing, something that needs to be teased out, because to disparage a lot of the more recent developments in Ireland, this home rule is often thrown up. And I think it needs to be looked at very realistically. And was it the solution to Ireland's troubles Or were the 1916 and the 1920 men, were they dead right and even more than right?
Well, the general view is that the violence did procure for us more than we would have got by peaceful methods. Whether if we had waited longer, but how long, would we have had to wait till 1947 to get to the time of the Indian independence to get all we wanted? That's one of these questions that we can't answer now. But we can be certainly sure that we wouldn't have got Dominion status, same as Canada and Australia, in 1916. But we were offered it in 1917, but we rejected it because it involved partition. And partition was entirely unacceptable to the people of Southern Ireland, as it became known popularly in 1917. But in 1921, the same package was on the table, and now we had to accept it. And we didn't actually debate very much about partition in the great Dáil debates of December, January 21, 22. Instead, we debated the oath. And the great credit to De Valera is that he dismantled the relics of empire and dominion status in the 1930s, very gently and easily, before he passed his own constitution. But certainly we had it at the time of Lloyd George's package, but we wouldn't have got it without killing. But then you've got to remember 500 people were killed, 250 were civilians, and 250 were people involved on each side. So would you tolerate that today? But you can't judge things by today. Don't forget at the Somme on day one, 20,000 were killed. Just on the first day, 20,000 British soldiers. So, so many were killed, and life would seem to be cheaper at that time than it's considered to be now.
Thanks.
Okay.
That's it.
Steve isn't here, and I'm sure Steve had this lined up. So I'd like to propose a vote of thanks to Michael for a wonderful evening. It's not my town, and it's not my particular subject, but it was an absolutely fantastic talk.
Yeah, it was great.
It kept us enthralled for an hour and a half. Thank you, Michael.